It didn't go with a bang or a scream, just a full-body hush, as if the building had inhaled and forgot what to do next. The monitors blinked to black in a single, synchronized blink that looked coordinated, the way flocks look coordinated when what they really are is afraid. In that one beat of dark, every machine in the ICU remembered it was only pretending to be a body's friend. I heard it the way you hear a child you love in a crowded room. The ventilator under bed 7's window failed to catch, paused, tried, and stuttered into silence. I ran before the silence decided to spread. Around me, screens struggled up from the dark like divers, one by one, a few lines at a time. Somewhere far below, the generator coughed the big diesel apology that says, "I'm late, I'm coming, hold everything still." The hallway flickered. Emergency strips came on and stayed on, the color of clean bones. The unit learned its edges without its usual glow. From room 2, a colleague called, "We're good," and from room 5, "We need a hand," and from somewhere in the middle, the charge nurse's voice steady as a metronome, "Generator online, online, hold okay partial, respiratory, sweep left to right, nurses call out your room, your status, your needs. If you can spare a hand, you're someone's hand." Room 7, vent failed to transfer, bagging, I said, and someone answered copy with the kind of trust that makes you braver. The official lights did not return. The generator did what old engines do when forced to remember their youth. It ran uneven and proud. Half the unit hummed, half listened. The medication pumps blinked a warning, then settled into battery mode, tiny countdowns suddenly meaningful. Far away, like thunder, the hospital announced itself, the long low groan of systems waking in the wrong order. Code teams in the stairwells, security at the doors, a nurse somewhere else holding a flashlight in her teeth. We have policies for this. They live in binders and they smell like laminate and meetings. But in the first minutes of a blackout, the policy is a sentence that begins with now. Now you count batteries. Now you identify who will not forgive you for a second mistake. Now you walk every bed with your eyes before you walk with your feet. I squeezed and the chest rose. I squeezed and the chest fell. I let myself look up long enough to find the patient's daughter in the chair by the window, both hands gripping the armrests as if that could hold the room together. "We're okay," I said. "We have him," she nodded, the kind of nod people do when they decide to believe you because the alternative is to learn a new kind of fear. The respiratory therapist slid in with a cart that had seen worse days. "Battery swapped," she said, her gloved hands moving like a pianist's backup vent already primed. "We'll bridge him until central catches, generators uneven," the charge nurse said over the unit phone, a voice carried on copper instead of air. "Facilities says we've got half capacity. Prioritize ventilators, heaters for neonates, select pumps, monitors on basic mode. Everything else paper, eyes, hands. Eyes, hands, paper." The first time I learned that order I thought it was quaint. Today it was doctrine. We worked left to right. Every bed got the same fierce attention and a different truth. Bed 1. Stable on the ventilator, battery good for an hour, set comfortable, pressure thoughtful but obedient. Bed 2. Elderly man, ventilator had transferred, but the pump feeding him vasopressors blinked a petulant orange, 3 bars, then 2. Bed 3. Soft machine breath, soft human breath, a partner with a sweater gathered tight under her chin, watching the rise and fall she had memorized. We spoke the numbers out loud to one another because spoken numbers are harder to ignore. In room 8, the ventilator was fine and the patient wasn't, which is its own kind of arithmetic. In room 4, the mother with the bright scarf had found the courage to unwrap it and lay it across her son's feet as if fabric remembers warmth longer than skin. In the corner of the nurse's station, the clock that never turns off, the one with red digits you could read from the moon, kept time with surgical cruelty. The generator burped. Every machine flinched. In the small pause, the unit looked at itself. 10 rooms, 10 arguments with physics. The charge nurse called, Respiratory count vents that fail to transfer and vents on battery only. Nurses call your pump counts. Anything that can go to gravity, go to gravity. Anything that can be paused safely, pause it and write the time. Pharmacy will triage high-risk infusions. Call them with names, not nicknames. If it's not saving a life this minute, it's waiting. If it is, you tell me and I will say your name louder than mine. I wrote times, the way you write in a storm. Flushes, pauses, restarts. I wrote the daughter's name as well as the patient's because I would need both later to remember which hand I had held and why. I wrote bagged 03, 1403, 22 and drew an arrow that meant felt longer. Manual checks complete, the respiratory therapist said into the air, which meant she had walked the unit and touched every breathing machine to make sure the breath it promised was the breath it was giving. 3 vents on backup battery, good for 60 minutes each. 2 vents on generator power. 2 vents not caught, 1 swapped to transport vent, 1 bag valve monitoring. That's 7, the charge nurse said. We have 9 vents in use. 9, I said. Room 7's on transport vent now. Room 9 is on home ventilator, battery pack at 70%. We all looked there. She was 26, spinal muscular atrophy, admitted with a pneumonia that didn't want to be told no. Her ventilator did not speak our network's language. It hummed its own. If the hospital became a cave, hers would still hum until it didn't. That made her both safer and more alone. Facilities came to our door with expressions like weather maps. Switching more loads to emergency, the lead said. We're shedding non-essential in imaging, admin, conference rooms. The ORs have to keep full power. We can't promise ceiling lifts or bed warmers. We can promise hallway lights and your red outlets, but the generator's flirting with its limits. You'll see dips while we rebalance. ICU, this is ED. A voice crackled through a radio one of us keeps because once we didn't. Heads up. Elevator banks B and C are intermittent. We're holding admissions in triage until you give green. We have 2 on high oxygen we can't keep downstairs if the wall flow keeps disagreeing with physics. No one said what we were all thinking. That oxygen wall flow is a promise built on pressure, and pressure needs pumps, and pumps need power. Somewhere, in a hub no family ever sees, steel cylinders and compressors and digital valves were in a conversation with a generator that hadn't had its coffee. Somewhere, someone was deciding if we reduce hospital-wide oxygen pressure for 15 minutes so the rest of the night could exist. I kept my hands moving and my voice sane. I breathed for the machine that had forgotten how. Okay, the charge nurse said into the unit phone. Here is the count. We have 9 ventilated patients. We have generator power to 2 vents with confidence, 3 more on battery that will last an hour if we nurse them. The rest are fragile or handled by hands. Facilities will try to move 1 more red circuit our way, but they can't promise when. We have to decide which 2 are tied to the generator now, and which 3 we watch like hawks on battery. We called it the list. We didn't call it triage because triage feels like war and this was a night shift. We called it the list and we started with the honest things. Which ventilators would fail gracefully? Which patients would? Which bodies hated dips and which barely noticed them? Which ventilators had internal batteries we trusted? And which were older friends we loved but didn't lean on? Room 9's home vent is good, Respiratory said. She has backup batteries and we can rotate them. Keep her where she is. Save red power for units that die outright. Room 2's vent is vintage, another said. She'll sulk with every dip. Plug her if we can. Room 8 is unstable, someone else said. He desated to 78 during the last flicker. He doesn't buy that this is fun. Room 5 is ready to extubate, I said. He was already scheduled for morning trial. If we had courage, we'd do it now. We have courage, the intensivist said from the doorway, his hair a map of the last 15 minutes. And we have too many fires. Extubate 5 if the numbers can stand it and you can be in the room. I'll be your hands if you say the word. in the kind of quiet that happens in buildings like ours when everyone is noisy somewhere else. We made more oxygen flow by turning fear into decisions. Room 5 took a deep breath and discovered his chest still belonged to him. Room 7 found a transport vent that thought our generator was charming. Room 2 got the red plug and forgave us nothing but tolerated everything. Room 9 smiled with her eyes and reached to tap her home machine, as if to say, "You and me, kid." Room 8 watched the world like a cliff watches a sea. From the waiting area, where the windows were now decorative and the coffee machines were sulking, families watched us use flashlights as punctuation. A woman whose nails had been painted for something happier asked, "Is the power coming back?" And I told her, in pieces, which was truer than anything else. "Who decides who stays on the good plugs?" asked a man in a suit to precise for 3 in the morning. "We do," I said. "And if you want to know why, I will tell you why in words that make sense." The generator dipped again, quick as a skipped heartbeat. Bed 8's saturation fell like a coin and then stopped at a number that should have felt safe and didn't. I turned the fraction of inspired oxygen up a notch and then another. His chest complained and then remembered its contract. I heard the charge nurse breathe out my name and then say, "We're okay," to someone who was not me. Facilities called back, "We can give you a third red," and the sound the unit made was not a cheer, but it was the thing that comes before one. "Which room?" the lead asked from the doorway, rolling an impossibly heavy cord over an impossibly clean floor. "Room 8, I said, because I could not pretend mercy is anything but specific. The cord reached, the plug fit, the machine decided it believed in electricity again. Bed 8's numbers pretended they weren't shaken. His wife pressed a hand to her own chest as if to remind it of the recipe. The hour stretched itself thin and then snapped back. We did the work people don't notice when rooms are bright. We checked lines that did not alarm but mattered. We wrote times that future versions of us would need to trust. We said names out loud so those names would not be alone in a building that had decided it was a cave. Then the generator stuttered in a new key. Not a dip, a stumble. The red outlets flickered and went dark, and so did a part of my head I had not realized was tied to them. Somewhere in the stairwells, someone swore loud enough to be a prayer. The building held its breath, and this time it did not let it out. "Battery only," the respiratory therapist said, and the way she said only was both diagnosis and curse. 50 minutes to 0 for most. 60 if we're nice. She glanced at room 9 and added, "Home vent 90 minutes if she's lucky." But luck has opinions. The charge nurse looked at the map that wasn't a map and said the line none of us wanted to say aloud. "We do not have enough battery to get everyone across if the generator doesn't stabilize. We have to choose which plugs get the first power when facilities brings us whatever they can. We have to choose." We had practiced this sentence in drills that felt performative. It did not feel performative now. The list stopped being a list and became a scale. Respiratory read out the vents that most hated dips. Pharmacy read the drips that turn into pumpkins. I read the faces I had memorized and the conversations I had promised. Someone said, "If 5 holds without the tube, that buys a battery back," and someone else said, "If 9 can stand lower settings, that buys us time," and the intensivist said, "If 8 needs proning, we cannot do that in the dark," and the charge nurse said, "We are not new at this. We will not make a decision alone." From the waiting area, a teenager with a hoodie asked, "Is my dad on the battery?" And the word dad carried more weight than all the laminate in the world. I said, "He is," and I added, "I'm his battery for now," and he nodded like the bravest person I had met tonight. We started moving battery life around like water in buckets. We lowered ventilator settings by single, careful clicks where we could. We grouped our hands so that one person could back 2 rooms for a minute each while another swapped in a fresh battery. We borrowed a transport vent from radiology that would insist on beeping at us like a scold but would breathe when it mattered. The generator tried again. It shuddered and held, then dropped, the way a person sometimes starts to stand and sits again. Minutes gathered in my pocket like stones. Facilities arrived with a rolling up's uninterruptible power supply that was really just a battery with wheels and ambition. One room, the lead said. Pick. We all looked at the same 2 rooms without needing to agree first. Room 8, the man who dropped like a coin with every flicker, and Room 2, the elderly woman whose vintage vent hated the present. 2 hands, 1 plug. The intensivist looked at the charge nurse, and the charge nurse looked at me, and I looked at the respiratory therapist who had not stopped moving since the dark began. The wife in 8 had both hands on the bedrail. The daughter in 2 had a hand on the glass of the door as if she could warm it from the outside. In the near dark, the building made a sound I had never heard from it before, something between a growl and a request. The generator was either catching or leaving us. You can't, I said, and he nodded like a person who already knew the word can't but had decided to audition for it anyway. Behind the UPS's wheels, Facilities cleared his throat gently, the way you clear a path through a forest. We have 90 seconds, he said, as if he were giving us a gift. The intensivist looked at the 2 rooms again, and the charge nurse lifted a hand, a conductor asking a string section to breathe. I took 1 step toward 8 and 1 step toward 2, and it felt like both steps added up to 0. Plug it here, the intensivist said, and it took me a full heartbeat to realize he had used the word and not the word. The generator growled, held, dipped, held. The UP stood ready like a small boat in a rising flood, its cord and umbilical waiting to declare a body. And the lights flickered, and someone screamed in another hallway, and the ventilator under my hands hiccuped hard enough to feel like a warning. The plug went in, and the ventilator in room 8 sighed itself back to belief. The numbers on his screen steadied as if someone had put a hand on a skittish animal. His wife let out a sound like a drawer closing softly. The UPS hummed, a small boat lashed to a larger storm. 8 is on the cart, the intensivist said. 2 stays on battery for now. He didn't look away from either doorway while he said it, as if eye contact itself could be an apology and a promise. The daughter in room 2 glanced from her mother to the red outlet gone dark and then to me. She had a scarf wound twice around her neck, the ends tucked in like someone who always prepared for cold. Is she safe? She asked, not loudly, not theatrically, just a person in a dim room wanting a verb. She is, I said. Her ventilator's battery is solid and we're watching it like it owes us rent. The next stable generator circuit we get is hers, I didn't add, or the next patient who declares an emergency louder. Honesty can be kind without being complete this second. The teenager with the hoodie, his name was Matteo. I learned by the way the unit clerk whispered it into his shoulder as if to remind him he had once stood as if waiting for me to hand him a job. I did. Flashlight captain, I said. Stand by your dad's door. If any monitor goes blank, just blank. Not flashing numbers. Step into the doorway and wave that light at me or the charge nurse. Big circles. You won't need to, because we'll see it. But if you do, you're part of the battery hour, manual sweep, Respiratory called, and we took the unit top to bottom like a tide. The rule was eyes, hands, paper. Eyes to confirm a chest rose with each breath the machine promised. Hands to feel warmth in the circuit where condensation collects warmth meant flow. Cold meant a secret. Paper to write the times because a blackout stretches minutes and then steals them, and the only way to win is to pin them to ink. We shaved our dependencies wherever we could. Drips that could run by gravity did. A heparin infusion became syringes spaced like chess moves, times written on tape across a pump that now only kept count for us instead of pushing molecules. The insulin algorithm turned from a polite electronic suggestion into a nurse with a pen, a glucometer, and an alarm set on her watch. The dopamine in room 2 got a new battery and a note on its handle with our initials, so if the lights came back and the world turned fast again, we would remember this was the pump that had been our endurance test, not a stranger needing assumptions. Room 5, the planned extubation looked at me with the kind of irritated alertness that says a body is already halfway out of the arrangement we made with it. The intensivist and I stood shoulder to shoulder, a flashlight on the vent screen throwing a pale bar across our chests like a shared sash. "You ready?" I asked the patient, though the question was more to his lungs than to his mind. He blinked, lifted his hand, and patted the tube with 2 fingers, the ICU's version of a signature. We did not make a speech. We suctioned. We loosened. We counted with our own breaths. Tube out. Cough. Cough again. The room held still in the way rooms do when they know they are in the seconds where future branches. "In through your nose," I said, and he did, and the first 3 breaths were clumsy and the 4th invented itself and then decided to stay. The oximeter lagged in the dark and made us wait for the good news like a person who loves dramatic timing, but the lips in front of me told the truth faster. They pinked. We left him on high flow with a portable tank and a plan scrawled large enough to follow by touch. If dips bag, call, replace with transport vent. Buy back that battery, the charge nurse said to no one and everyone, and somewhere down the hall the respiratory therapist grinned in a way only people with mask lines across their cheeks can grin. Facilities radioed. "We think we can push 1 more red outlet to you in 5 minutes. 5 minutes is generous when your lungs work." We put that generosity on layaway with room 2's name next to it. A nurse from the NICU popped her head around the doorjamb, eyes like polished coins in the dim. "We're okay," she said preemptively, "because we all assume we are other people's problems. But if you see a free warmer that's not non-essential, call us. We've got skin to skin, we're fine. Just letting you know." The way she said letting you know sounded like, "We will be our own storm, don't borrow it." "Appreciate you," the charge nurse said, and meant it a little more than the words themselves. It's a city under our feet, the hospital's guts, oxygen trees and manifolds and pressure reducers and alarms that talk to other alarms in a language only engineers feel loved by. We were tenants on the penthouse floor with our windows dark. Downstairs someone was keeping the boilers hot enough to argue with physics. "I'll tell them they're guests on the world's worst couch," Edie said back. "Humor the duct tape that keeps a voice from splitting." In room 9, the young woman with the home ventilator looked at her mother, then at me, then at the device that had been her thorax's partner for years. "She's good for 90, Respiratory had said, and if you've never learned how fast 90 minutes can be, try loving someone whose machine has a clock." We rotated her backup battery onto the charger as soon as the generator winked at us for 30 seconds, then swapped back when it winked away, like farmers stealing water during a drought. Her mother asked for an outlet for the phone and then shook her head at herself, apologized to the dark, and tucked the phone away. The girl reached out and tapped my sleeve a little knock and I leaned in. She whispered around the leak of the trash, "If my home vent dies, I can hand vent with the manual if you tell me how." Her eyes were a dare. "You're not going to need to," I said. And then, "Because courage needs jobs, but if we ask you to, your job is to count with us. We'll squeeze. You count." The cart with the extra red outlet arrived like a small parade. Facilities had scrounged another UPS from the cath lab, painted beige and defiant. "One more," the lead said, cheeks bright, as if he had brought a gift from a far coast. We rolled it to room 2 and the daughter stepped back as if a tide had come to her feet. "Plug in." The ancient ventilator did something like a sigh and then something like a shrug and then decided it would be magnanimous. The daughter touched the bedrail with the back of her hand as if blessing it. "Okay," the charge nurse said to the unit, voice pitched so it would bounce off the right corners. "Our red outlets are on 8 and 2. 7 is on transport vent. 9 is on home. 5 is free, breathing on his own. 3 on battery with an hour to spare. 4 on generator circuit from the main panel. If you see any battery get to 1 bar, you scream. If you think you might see it, you scream softer. If any screen goes blank, you scream louder. Define scream," someone called, "because dark makes people brave with jokes." "Scream with words," she said, "preferably. Help, but I'll take now. Transparency is a drug that works even when the lights don't." We gathered families near the nurse's station where the emergency strips made everyone look a little ghostly but at least present. I stood with a clipboard that had turned into a prop and a flashlight. I did not point at faces. You're seeing us use battery and backup power the way we use our hands and our ears on purpose, I said. Here is what we're doing and why. I did not lecture. I narrated. I told them which rooms were plugged into circuits the generator loved and which were on carts the generator tolerated and which were on batteries we were nursing like old dogs. I told them that we had extubated one patient to give the others a chance at a plug, that we had a home ventilator in the mix that bought us time, not because her life counted less, but because her machine counted differently. I told them the uncomfortable truth we live by even in daylight, that we match the right resource to the right body in the right minute, and that the minute changes, and so does the right. I told them we write down our reasons so we can defend them to our future selves and to anyone who deserves an answer later. A man in a suit, the same one, asked, "Do you decide by age?" I had expected the question to arrive eventually with teeth. It arrived instead like a curiosity someone had finally found breath for. "No," I said. "We decide by physiology, by the behavior of each machine, by minutes left in batteries, by which dip each body hates most, and by who can be made safer with a different plan. We don't weigh worth, we weigh risk, we watch each other," I said. "And we tell you what we're doing. That's the supervision that matters." At 3 in the morning, we went back to being hands. Pharmacy materialized with a caddy of labels like talismans, marking every pump we had touched so no one would confuse an improvised plan with an error later. The intensivist drifted from room to room like a tide, pausing long enough at 8 to speak a sentence to the wife that made her shoulders drop. "We chose your husband's room first because he did the worst with the dips. We will not forget that we owe to next." She put a hand to her chest again. "Less drama this time. The body is better at the second startle." Somewhere in the building, a generator panel clicked over like a chess clock. The red outlets flickered once, then held. A collective exhale moved through the unit and made the curtains barely stir. We looked at each other like conspirators who had succeeded at something mathematical. An hour later, as if insulted by our optimism, the fire alarm chirped once in the distance and then remembered itself and shut up. We all laughed because laughter is cheap oxygen you make yourselves. The ED sent 2 staff up the stairs with oxygen tanks like Sherpas, one patient on a non-rebreather between them. Paku found a way to keep the other. We did not take new people. We kept the people we had. I am still not sure if that counts as generosity or selfishness. Maybe both. The ethics committee would bless one word in daylight. Night shifts live with both. In room 2, the daughter unwound her scarf at last and folded it into her lap. "My mother hates the dark," she said conversationally to the ventilator, as if the machine understood Portuguese. "She always slept with the hallway light on when we were kids." The ancient vent, held up by the borrowed arc of beige plastic and stubborn electrons, wheezed in a rhythm that had outlasted newer fashions. I slipped my hand along the sheet and tucked it near the patient's shoulder, not to warm but to weigh. "People stay where weight is." Mateo's flashlight drew 2 thoughtful circles in the doorway to get my attention and then a third exuberant one for decoration. "All good?" I asked, and he nodded. "They said I could count breaths," he said, almost proud, as if he had discovered a minor planet. "I'm doing it in my head. If I get to 60 and it's not a minute, I'll tell you." There are 100 ways to be useful. Tonight he had invented one. The ICU has a sound during blackouts that no simulation can reproduce. The chorus of portable devices, each with its own accent, singing their uptime. The transport vent in 7 clicks like a metronome. The ups in 8 hums with a faint tremor. The old pump into mutters to itself. The home machine in 9 uses a pitch that stays just inside human hearing, the way dog whistles stay just outside. It's a comfort and a torture. When the big systems come back, the silence will feel like a luxury. Pressures falling a touch, the respiratory therapist said in 8, eyes on the waveform, fingers on the chest. He's tiring even on support, We traded a look that had the whole vocabulary of "can we buy him time" in it. "If we prone him," she began, and I shook my head. The room was too crowded for the theater of turns in the dark, and we were one stumble away from lines in a knot. "Later," I said. She nodded, not in defeat, just in sequencing. We bought him time with small, unglamorous things. Warmed his hands, loosened the mask, repositioned slightly so a ribcage could remember a better angle. His wife hummed something that sounded like a song written by someone who loved water. "Generator stabilizing," facilities said over the radio, voice half laugh. "Don't marry it, but you can hold its hand." We did. We let ourselves take the red outlets off the UPS carts and back to the wall where fate had intended them. We left the carts in the room anyway, cables coiled but plugged, because superstition is just experience wearing a nice shirt. Morning threatened the windows with a pallor dark. Night shift is a long hallway with fewer doors. Dawn puts doors back in. The intensivist rubbed a hand over his face and said, "We need to hand this off in a way that doesn't make day shift think we were telling ghost stories." He wasn't joking. Documentation is the bridge we build for the versions of ourselves who slept. We wrote that bridge. Times of dips, names of rooms, which machine threw tantrums and which sulked quietly, which battery bars had been liars, which families we had told what, and who had nodded like a person trying not to invent catastrophes in their head, which red circuits we had claimed and which we had promised. We wrote that Five breathed on his own and said coffee as his first request, which was almost unkind given the state of the cafeteria. We wrote that Nine's home vent was a grace and a risk and that both truths could live in the same sentence. As the unit changed color from pewter to steel, the charge nurse said, "Before we close this hour, we owe room 2 a conversation." It was not a confession. It was a ledger item. We stood with the daughter and the ventilator that had been the unit's single most dramatic employee and we told the story out loud. 8 had desaturated to the 70s with each dip. 2 had fussed but held. We had placed the UPS in 8 first, with the promise to bring the second as soon as it physically existed. We had considered moving 2 to a transport vent and decided not to until we had the extra outlet, because old circuits sometimes punish you for your ambitions. We set the part that was personal because pretending otherwise is a betrayal. We made each call together so no one had to own it alone. The daughter listened and then did a thing that people do when you give them real reasons. She looked at her mother's face instead of the machine's and exhaled. "I wouldn't have forgiven you if you hadn't told me," she said. "Not because of what you did, because of what I could have imagined. We did the post-action piece, the thing that keeps nights like this from becoming lore instead of learning." Facilities brought a laminated map that showed which breakers had misbehaved and why the wall in the East Corridor had turned into a diva. Pharmacy logged the pumps that had tolerated gravity and the ones that had taught us new curses, and we promised to trade the curse list for a capital request. Respiratory wrote a love letter to the transport vent in 7 and an ultimatum for the vintage one in 2. The intensivist flagged the policy that said families could hand vent in community hospitals during disasters and wrote a sticky note that said, in handsome block letters, "Not here. We have our own disasters. We rent our courage from professionals." Mateo's father dozed, alive in a way that makes the whole world look like it has edges again. Mateo handed the flashlight back to me like a baton and said, "I kept count," and I said, "We noticed," and he nodded like a person let into a club whose only role is you have to keep showing up. When the first pink rinsed the unit and the day nurse's shoes squeaked their first day squeak, the building exhaled in a long, consistent purr. The generator had stopped flirting and had either married us or left us for main power. At that point, it didn't matter. The red outlets stayed red. The monitors glowed like obedient planets. The coffee machine downstairs decided it was ready to believe again. And then, just before the day felt safe enough to hand to someone else, a hiss ran through the unit like a rumor. It came from everywhere and nowhere: vents, walls, under doors. Every nurse lifts their head at the oxygen sound. It is the pipe equivalent of a baby's first cry and a last breath at once. Anyone else hearing a pressure drop? Respiratory called, too calm to be calm. My oximeters began to drift as if a tide had reversed. The green digits did not dive. They wandered toward a number you would call the past. I opened the valve on a portable tank and watched the gauge fall faster than it should. Central oxygen just took a knee, facilities said, voice suddenly very awake. We're switching manifolds. You have 2 minutes at current flow before the low pressure alarms become your religion. 2 minutes. Enough to divide a night from a morning, not enough to divide a promise from a plan. We did, and we had practiced choosing. That helps less than you'd think and more than you'd hope. Go, the intensivist said, left to right, prioritize high flow and anyone who can't forgive the wall. We went. The battery hour had turned into the oxygen minute, and in room 8, the ups hummed faithfully while the ventilator drew on a pipe that suddenly had less to give, and the wife's humming paused, and her mouth opened to make a question that had too many possible answers. It started as a rumor in the walls and turned into punctuation. Vents sighed, masks murmured, the metal whisper at the valves thinned. Every nurse hears oxygen the way musicians hear a missed note. The air told us it was not as generous as it had been 5 minutes ago. Central is switching manifolds, facilities said on the radio. We've got a frozen valve on the primary. Backup's engaged, but pressure is low until the liquid tank catches. Low pressure feels like a building that has decided to breathe through a straw. The numbers on high-flow cannulas stalled at flows they had tolerated easily all night and began to look offended. Non-rebreathers fluttered on faces that had, until now, accepted their bargain. Ventilators drew their prescribed volume and complained about the resistance as if the lungs had moved farther away. 2 minutes, the charge nurse repeated, not as a threat but as a metronome. Oxygen minute. Prioritize. Left to right. We had made a list because batteries had made us write one. Now we leaned that list against a new storm. The same rooms, different physics. Roommate first, not because he was the only fragile thing, but because he turned fragility into theater. His saturation dipped with the wall sigh and not in the civil way we call a trend. It flinched as if numbers could startle. We cracked a tank and moved his circuit to its simple mercy. The gauge turned its little arc of green toward yellow in a way that makes you better at math than you were in school. We tightened the mask and loosened the mask and tightened it again, the way you do when you are teaching a stubborn jar that it can open without drama. Room 2, respiratory called, hand already on the transport cylinder. The ancient ventilator that had hated electricity now hated pressure. We flipped the selector valve to tank and coaxed the machine into pretending it had always planned to be easy. The daughter's hands, for once, were empty. She had wrapped her scarf around the base of the tank as if dressing it for work. Room 9's home ventilator, traitor and ally, did not care what the walls felt. It drew from its own bottle and its own batteries and looked at us with the serene cruelty of a system that, tonight, didn't need us at all. We checked her gauge anyway and rotated bottles set aside for her so her 90 minutes could be growing instead of shrinking. Her mother mouthed thank you as if we had invented tanks ourselves. Room 7, the transport vent with its crisp metronome, complained earlier than expected. He doesn't like low inlet, respiratory said, flipping him to a tank with the speed of habit. His waveform relaxed, a graph forgetting it had tensed. He'll give the wall another chance in 10, room 5, newly extubated, said upright with the stubborn dignity of someone who refuses to admit to being tired while the room is watching. We added a second portable tank behind his high flow so we could flip in a heartbeat if the wall's apology came late. He raised an eyebrow at me as if to ask if this counted as a victory lap. It counts, I said. He nodded, the nod of someone who had learned the shapes of small wins. The ED's runner arrived at the threshold with a tank for us and lungs like a bellows. Paku says they can hold one on high flow with their tanks. We kept the other downstairs with Sherpas. Oxygen Tree says you get priority when the manifold equalizes. The way he said priority sounded like thank you and I'm sorry had produced a child and given it a clipboard. Tell Paku we owe them post-shift donuts, the charge nurse said. Tell the oxygen tree we'll name a plant after him, her. Facilities corrected on the radio, deadpan. We all know the tree is a her, we laughed, patients not included. Humor does not fix pressure. It does fix hands. The oxygen minute turned into 10 and then into a practice. Conserve where the body will tolerate it. Spend where the body is not in a mood to negotiate. We dropped FiO2 by single ticks on stable vents and promised those numbers a stern talking to if they misbehaved. We coached slow breaths with visual cues because words don't move air, hands do. We traded blanket warmth for wrist warmth because the first keeps comfort. The second keeps oximeter readings honest. Families watched us trade wall to tank and back like street magic. We narrated the trick loudly enough that no one would assume we were improvising without a plan. The wall is low, the tank is fat, I said to one room, pointing not as a lesson but as a reassurance. We use the tank for 10, wall for 5, then back to tank until facilities tells us the tree is generous again. If the gauge says the tank is almost empty, it's not a cliff, it's a ramp. We have the next tank at the door before we need it. People like ramps. Cliffs are for movies. Mateo drifted between helping and obeying, flashlight now tucked into a scrub pocket like a talisman. He counted his father's breaths in his head and then out loud quietly enough that only the bed heard. When a tank change came to the room next door, he moved his counting to the door and made himself a human alarm with the light, 2 slow circles that meant I see you, do you see me? The charge nurse gave him the kind of nod you give someone who has earned their way out of the waiting room without being asked to leave it. We did. We inched room 8 back to the wall. He tolerated it for a breath, 2, 10, and then the number twitched and we retreated to the tank like a dance move we pretended to invent. Room 2 stayed on the bottle because that ancient ventilator had the personality of a cat. It remembered insult longer than we remembered sequence. Room 7 tolerated the wall as if it had always had faith. Room 9 remained Switzerland. Room 5 asked for water. I brought him ice chips because I know how to say no without making it a punishment. Update, the intensivist said to the unit, making the air carry his voice, hands braced on the charting desk like a person leaning on the deck of a ship. Facilities estimates full oxygen pressure in 30. Electricity is stable on emergency circuits and flirts with Maine. We'll act like it isn't until it is. ED will hold until we say the word. Paku is our neighbor and our friend, he looked at me. We'll debrief the list after sunrise. For now, we owe 8 a conversation fast and honest. We went together because that's how you deliver sentences that shouldn't have to live alone and stood at the foot of 8's bed. The wife had stopped humming. She was reading the room with the intensity of a person memorizing. We told her the part most people never learn and all of us deserve to hear, that her husband's body hated the dips more than room 2's did, that we had placed the first ups with him and the second with 2 as soon as it existed, that when the wall oxygen sighed, we chose bottles for him and promised our next bottles to her neighbor. We said the quiet part out loud, that we match resources to bodies, not to stories, that we write the reasons down so shame does not volunteer later to rewrite them. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked at room 2's door as if she could see through drywall. Tell her that, she said. Tell her you told me first. The clock thought it was still night. The windows began to argue. The city outside had its own blackout logic streetlights making little islands where people would later say they had met their neighbors for the first time. In our cave, the generators finally decided to be boring. The red outlets stayed red. The ups carts idled like patient horses. The tanks in use dropped from dramatic to domestic. Their needles moved in a way that allowed for coffee. Day shift arrived in a current of voices and zippered jackets. Some carried headlamps like miners. Others had the look of people who had just learned they would be paid to improvise and were brave enough to grin at the idea. We passed the story like a relay baton, careful to name the names and list the reasons, not because reasons make you right, but because reasons make you reliable. We gave them the map, which plugs had lied, which pumps had turned into pumpkins, which rooms had learned to forgive the wall and which had not. In room 3, a water trap filled in a way that seemed too eager. I popped it and let the condensation gather in a cup with the sound of a soft apology. The partner in the chair said, "I used to work in a refinery," as if confessing a bias. When pressure drops in a pipe, we slow draws on the branches, not the trunk. I liked him immediately. "We're doing both," I said. "Trunk gets love from facilities. We feather the branches so they don't suck the trunk dry." He nodded, worry given something technical to hold. Across the hall, a monitor took a small artistic liberty with a heart rate and drew it taller than it should be. I looked up in time to see the patient roll and the lead scold him. Electrical drama, not biological. I adjusted the sticker, cursed the gel that had decided to be less adhesive when the air changed, and made a note. Humidity makes friends with bad telemetry. "Call from ED," the unit clerk said, her voice already doing triage even for information. "Elevator B is limping but alive. They've got a copped exacerbation in their resus bay that hates the wall worse than yours do. They swear they'll bring their own tanks. They want to know if you'll take him if we say please very nicely." The intensivist and the charge nurse exchanged the look I now think of as the night's thesis. "We are not a hotel. We are a promise." Promises are not forever. They are for now. "If they bring 2 full tanks and a respiratory therapist," the charge nurse said, "and if facilities blesses the pressure tree. Otherwise, Paku gets him with donuts." "Facilities blesses," facilities said, because they had been listening like a benevolent gossip. "The tree is a queen and she is pleased." It is hard to explain to people who don't live in hospitals why one more patient can feel like a mathematical problem rather than a moral one. It isn't because we don't care. It's because caring without arithmetic is theater. We do not do theater. We do choreography. The copped patient arrived on an elevator that sighed like a person who had been carrying furniture. He came with 2 tanks and a therapist who had forearms like a sailor and eyes like a scientist. We tucked him into room 6 and discovered that he hated masks and loved negotiation. "We can do this with less drama if you treat me like a partner," he said between breaths that sounded like argue and agree. I promised partnership and meant it. We traded him from a non-rebreather to a high-flow cannula with enough flow to make him feel heard and enough reserve to make me feel sane. By 9 in the morning, the building decided to be a building again. Lights stayed on in a normal color. The coffee spilled the way coffee always spills, like it does not care about drama. The red outlets were just red, not talismans. The wall oxygen turned into infrastructure, which is what help should be when it is doing its job, invisible. We were writing our last notes when the head of facilities walked in with a roll of maps and a look that meant post-mortem while the body is alive. He pointed to the primary oxygen manifold on the blueprint and showed us the valve that had frozen, the reason the backup had hesitated, the trick he had taught it in the middle of the night. He traced pathways to outlets that had lied and showed us why the East subpanel had flirted with us so rudely. He used a finger to draw around the ores we had left powered without question and thanked us for not making him argue about it. "Next time," he said, and we all groaned at the optimism embedded in those words, "we'll stage the UPS carts closer to rooms 2 and 8 from the start. We'll swap the vintage vent if we can get Biomed to let us pry it from its shrine. We'll put quick disconnects on the most stubborn oxygen branches so you can flip to tanks without wizardry. And we'll lend you one of our portable oxygen analyzers so you don't have to trust the wall's mood. Add donuts to Paku to the list," the charge nurse said, "and name a plant after the oxygen tree." "We did," he said. "Her name is Valentina." After the valve, we applauded because sometimes you clap for the joke and sometimes you clap for the night that did not take anyone away. I should have ended my shift there. I should have handed the list to the day nurse and gone home to sleep with my phone face down and my brain loose in its case. But as I walked past room 8, His wife stopped humming and said my name as if it were a lever. He's different, she said. Not worse, not better, different. The waveform agreed in a way that made the hairs at the back of my neck consider standing. I called the respiratory therapist back with a look. She pressed fingers to ribs and frowned at the equality of their rise. The ventilator traced a plateau where it had loved a valley. The intensivist arrived with a stethoscope and the habit of hoping for boring findings and not getting them. Breath sounds decreased on the right, he said. Subtle. He looked at me and then at the wall where the emergency light had left us a shadow we no longer needed. Portable chest, he said, and radiology said the elevator was in a mood and they would be 5. We stood in the oxygen-rich, light normal, coffee-smelling quiet that had taken us hours to earn and watched for one kind of disaster while the night that had already happened pretended to be over. The X-ray tech arrived with a machine that looked like a friendly robot. We helped position like we had trained together, which we had, if you count every other night as training for this one. The image printed itself on a screen with the same indifferent grace a sunrise has. The right lung looked less like participation and more like a rumor. Small pneumothorax, the intensivist said. Maybe from the barotrauma earlier. We'll watch. If it grows, we'll tap. He said it calm and kind, the way you pronounce rain when you have an umbrella in your hand. The wife resumed humming. The waveform remembered its valley. The number remembered how not to be dramatic. The coffee remembered how to be bad and necessary. 1 minute. Long enough to put your hands where you want them when the wave hits. Not long enough to invent a new list. We looked at each other with the look of people who have already done a night's worth of math and are being asked for one more equation. Ground everything, the charge nurse said. Unplug what can forgive it. Hands on ventilators that can't. I reached for room 8's plug out of habit and stopped myself because habit is a cousin of error. Inside, the oxygen tree hummed like a queen. Hands on vents, the charge nurse said, and our hands were already there. The surge rolled through the unit like a rumor that liked electricity. The red outlets held. One beige plug near a sink sulked. A monitor drew a theatrical flat line and then remembered its job when I receded a lead. Facility status, the intensivist asked, the voice of authority wearing the apology of need. Main's back, facilities said over the radio, but she came in hot. Suppressors took the punch. We're trimming load, watching harmonics. Don't introduce new toys. Let the breakers forgive the insult first, we had learned from the battery hour. We left the ups carts parked like small altars. We let the wall outlets prove themselves before we shook hands. Room 8's ventilator rode the ups and sniffed at the wall like a cautious dog. Room 2's vintage vent did what old machines do, pretended the night had been theoretical and asked with dignity to resume its routine. At bed 8, the waveform had found its valley again, but his breaths rode rougher. The small pneumothorax we had named like a weather system had learned a new adjective, stubborn. His wife watched the screen the way you watch a stove you don't trust. Ultrasound, the intensivist said. The portable machine purred awake and painted rib spaces in gray. A plural slide failed to slide. Air where friction belonged. Small but growing, he said. We can tap with a pigtail here. You okay if we do it bedside? He asked the wife as if consent were a piece of furniture to be shared, not a form to be signed. We set the field and light that wouldn't satisfy a photographer but pleased a surgeon. Chlorhexidine drew a clean circle. Drapes. Local. I narrated for her and for the part of my brain that remembers steps when rooms make new rules. We numb. Small nick. Follow the guide. You'll hear air good. He flinched at the first burn and then relaxed into the dull tug. The intensivist threaded the catheter between ribs 3 and 4, hit a pocket, and the room learned what it sounds like when a lung returns to itself, a soft surrender, a small applause of physics. We secured the line, dressed the site, tied the tube to a drainage bag that didn't need electricity to keep a promise. The number on the monitor liked our decision. The waveform agreed to be reasonable again. The wife found her sternum with her palm, the way people remind their hearts they have job descriptions. Matteo appeared at the door, hood down now, hair doing the startled thing hair does after a long night. The lights look like sci-fi, he said, then added quickly, in a good way, as if he might offend the building. He eyed the pleural drain. What's that do? Gives the lung a room of its own again, I said. Air was crowding it out. We made space. He catalogued the metaphor like a tool, then reported. Dad's monitor threw a tantrum. Said he was flat. He wasn't. It just wanted attention. Monitors are dramatic, I said lightly. Drama is safer once the wave passes. With main power steadying, the oxygen tree sang in a key that lowered shoulders by degrees. Facilities arrived with sacrificial power strips and faces that said we survived math. They traced the route the surge had taken with their hands, the way we show families where a tube travels when a drawing isn't enough. East Suppanel took the mood, the lead said. We'll baby her. He patted a wall as if it had a back to rub. Day shift truly took the floor, coffees in hand and pupils unamused by our jokes. We handed off room by room, not with legend but with reasons. Room 5, extubated. Room 7, transport vent until biomed signs off. Room 2, vintage diva on a fresh red. Room 9, sovereign nation. Room 8, chest pigtail after a surge-honored night. The day charge circled decisions with a pen as if drawing halos around moments that had behaved. I should have left then. Sleep felt mythical. But blackouts make orphans of tasks, and I don't like leaving orphans. I stayed to shepherd 3, a reconciliation that had turned into a maze, a family meeting with an interpreter, and a promise I'd made in the dark that only counts if I keep it in the light. The interpreter wore pilot headphones. The family had learned to sit in a circle that makes room for bad news. We told the night without suspense, what we chose first and why, what we owed and how we paid, how plugs matched lungs and tanks matched attitudes. The grandmother listened with the posture of a queen and said, through the interpreter, you narrate your reasons. That makes them less heavy to carry for us. With the surge tamed and the list living in ink instead of adrenaline, the unit remembered ordinary rituals, brushing teeth for people who had forgotten mint, warm socks for feet that believe dignity includes fuzz, day shift jokes about night shift heroics and night shift replies pretending to be offended. Post-action in 10, the intensivist said. We met, owned our guesses, and turned them into changes. Stage-ups at 2 and 8, retire the vintage vent if biomed agrees, and add quick disconnects on stubborn oxygen branches. As the meeting ended, registration sent a messenger. The family from room 2 is downstairs. They refuse to leave overnight. They want to talk to whoever chose plugs. Me, I said, because even when it isn't me, my name gets written on reasons. They were 4, a brother, a sister, an aunt, and a neighbor translating emotions more than words. The daughter with the scarf said, thank you. Not because you chose us second, because you told us first, and told them you'd told us. Being forgiven for something you can defend is a peculiar high. I accepted it like a tide you don't argue with. If anything is missing, I can add it, I said. If anything is wrong, I can repair it. It's good, the brother said. We just needed to know the room had adults, too many, the aunt muttered, and we laughed because she wasn't wrong. Back in 8, he was breathing without performing it for the room. The pigtail took what air it needed and then stopped asking for attention. His wife had taken off her shoes. That's how you know a nervous system has started to forgive a building. I can't give you the plastic, I said, but I can give you a sketch of what we did and why, with times and words. Paper weighs less, she nodded, and I watched a document turn into proof. Before I stepped away, I showed her the note we had written in real-time times, names, and the plain words we used in the dark. She traced one line with a finger and said, this will help him remember a night he slept through. The call light in 7 dinged with a sitcom sound. The transport vent brave all night through a new code. The respiratory therapist's hand found the bag automatically. He's fine, she said. But the machine is done being brave. Swap it, I said, too fast. She paused the math without paper pause. If we pull now, we risk the dip he hates. If we flirt it back to life, We spend time we can't afford. If it quits, call biomed, the charge said. We'll stand with hands and decide with information, not hope. Transport vent error 31, biomed answered on the second ring, the sound of coffee working. Inlet sensor sulking after a surge. Power cycle hard, then soft. If it persists, I'll bring the orange one. The orange one is newer and proud. We love it and pretend not to. We performed the ritual. Off. Wait. On. The machine reconsidered its identity and decided not to be offended. If it throws it again, biomed said, trade up. I'll park the orange outside like a race car. I turned to leave and saw, in the glass of the door, my face older than the hour deserved, and behind it, in reflection, a man where no one should be. At the oxygen manifold closet, hand on a wheel he had no reason to touch. Visitor badge. Worry for a uniform. He was about to twist a valve that would make the tree's song go thin again. Sir, I said, moving, voice gentle the way you make it when you don't want to startle a deer before taking the keys from its mouth. That isn't for us. He turned, guilt and ignorance wrestling across his face. It was hissing, he said. I thought he didn't finish. There are too many ends to that sentence. Behind me, 2 and 8 and 7 hummed in their different keys. Matteo, at his father's door, saw my body change direction and lifted his light without being told. He hesitated. He looked at the valve like a person considers a door half opened. Somewhere deep in the building a compressor kicked on and the floor vibrated like a warning. Security was already on the way. We have a button and we had pressed it. But seconds, like oxygen, are currency, and he was about to spend mine. I held the wheel still as if it were the throat of a story. For a fraction of a second the hiss changed its opinion and then remembered itself. Security arrived, breathless without running, and took the man with the gentle efficiency of people who move worry for a living. The building exhaled. The oxygen tree kept singing. There are 2 kinds of blackouts. The kind where lights leave you, and the kind where someone almost turns them off with a good intention and a wrong hand. Back in the unit, the intensivist studied me like a person who has seen a shadow pass over a lake and can't tell if it was a cloud or a wing. Everything? He asked. Everything, I said. For now. He smiled small, real. For now is my favorite kind of always. I finally surrendered the unit the way you hand a baby to arms you respect. I signed the last things that demanded signatures and left the list where lists go to become part of a building's memory. The elevator took its time deciding to be helpful. In the lobby, sunlight found a patch of floor and made it an altar. I stood in it for the length of a breath, maybe 2, hands still remembering the wheel. My phone buzzed. A text from ethics. If we must choose, we choose together, and we write why. I typed back. And we tell them first. She answered with a single check mark, the bureaucratic emoji for grace. I walked toward a morning that felt less like victory and more like a receipt. Between heartbeats there is a space. Last night we kept filling it with reasons. Today they could stand on their own without our hands. I let myself think the story had closed its circle. The call from ED carried a silence we recognized. Silences have dialects. This one meant, we have a problem. We don't have a plan. We'd like to borrow yours. ICU, the ED attending said finally, voice steady with effort. We've got 2 we can't keep. A postpartum seizure with aspiration intubated, high requirements, and a teenager with head trauma, pupils disagreeing about the world, or paging for emergent chrony. PACU's power is fussy. They can host one on oxygen and prayer, not to with vents. We need a bed with a guaranteed red outlet for their hold while they flip rooms. The charge nurse glanced at the panel we had drawn by hand and dated with 3 different hours. Our red outlets are true, generator-bonded promises were spoken for. 8 had 1, a marriage we would not annul. His numbers liked vows. 2 had another, the vintage diva who forgave nothing and held everything as long as she had the exact kind of attention she liked. We had carts and ups boxes and a wall that was behaving, but guaranteed meant red without caveat. We can free one, the intensivist said, Not because the decision was easy, but because the math insisted on being done aloud. But we don't pretend it's free. We make the move in a room that won't punish us for touching it. The daughter with the scarf looked up from her folded hands. The ventilator's screen reflected in her eyes like a small city at night. We'll talk with her first, I said, and the charge nurse nodded. We do nothing to a body without speaking to the people who love it as if they are part of the circulatory system. We went in together. The vintage machine sat like a retired queen invited back for a single ceremony. It hated the darkness we had endured but had admitted, finally, that we meant well. We have a request, I said to the daughter. ED needs one of our red outlets for a patient who isn't here yet but is in that stretch where minutes behave like glass. We can keep your mother safe on a transport vent while we give them the plug if we do it with a ritual we trust and people we trust in the room. We'll hold her by the hand and by the numbers. If her numbers do not like the idea, we undo it faster than we did it, because 8 will not forgive us for touching him, I said. Because your mother's lungs accept breaths from many friends as long as they are polite. Because the transport vent in the hall is newer than the one she's on. Because we will be the hands. And because ED's boy is borrowing time, Respiratory rolled in the orange transport vent, the one Biomed had promised like a race car, and laid its circuit next to the vintage one the way you lay two maps side by side. We rehearsed out loud as if the room were a classroom. Pre-oxygenate on the current circuit. Match settings. Confirm alarms. On 3, quick exchange old off. New on leak check, chest rise, waveform, saturation. Everyone had a job. The daughter's job was to say now if her eyes saw what our numbers hadn't yet formed. 3, circuit swap, 1 breath held, the new machine recognizing a new friend. The chest rose. The waveform smiled a small engineer's smile. The saturation dipped a point for drama and then remembered its manners. We watched for a full minute because a minute is the difference between a good idea and an anecdote. The transport vent proved it had no ideological conflicts with lungs. We offered the vintage machine respect by not unplugging it yet. It had earned the right to exit without indignity. Free the red, the charge nurse said to facilities, who appeared like stagehands during a set change. They ran the thick cord from 2's wall to a labeled post at the head of 6. We put a fresh suction canister at the rail and a crash cart facing the door. ED inbound, the clerk called. Teenage male, GCS 9, high FiO2, pressure cautious, unequal pupils. Or hold in 10. We are the bridge. We made ours out of a red outlet and the decision the daughter had trusted us to make transparently. The gurney arrived with a practiced sigh. The respiratory therapist from ED kept a hand on the bag like a person holding a child's hand while crossing a street. We tried the wall, she said. It made promises it couldn't keep. Thank you for the red. We took him from their hands to ours and kept it a room, not a hallway. Holding pressure, the neurosurgeon said. 10 minutes. Keep him at the edge of good. Don't let him fall into bad. We'll meet you on the other side of the doors. His name was written on the band. His mother's phone buzzed with calls that would go unanswered for the next hour. Matteo watched from his doorway with respectful focus. The daughter understood her post, less worried now because the transport vent had adopted her mother and the adoption seemed happy. Or as green, a voice said. Roll on your call. We rolled. Red outlet unplugged with a practiced twist. The transport vent breathed without memory of wires. The doors took the boy the way storms take ships. We checked the unit by reflex. 2 tolerated the orange vent. 8's chest moved with confidence. 7's transport vent behaved. 9's home machine purred like an old ally. Document the why, the charge nurse said, and I loved her a little for the way she said why as if it were a noun you could hold. We wrote, freed red outlet from room 2 after safe swap to transport vent. Allocated to or hold for emergent chrony. Rationale time critical brain injury requires guarantee. UPS alternative rejected surge artifacts. We wrote these things so the morning would not have to guess at our conscience. ED again, the clerk said, voice a hair to calm. Postpartum seizure patient is rising on FiO2. PACU's wall is gassy about flow. If we can't take her, they'll keep her with 2 tanks and a prayer in triage. We can take her, the intensivist said, if we replace hope with choreography. He pointed at 6, our bridge bed now empty, and at 4, which had behaved all morning. Make 4 our tank bed for an hour. Rotate spare cylinders. Pull 2 into the bay nearest the panel so the transport vent can sip off ups if the wall pouts. Tell PACU the truth. We can hold her safely if they send her with runway. 2 full tanks and a third that isn't lying, I said. A nurse who doesn't mind clergy metaphors. A family who can be told we will tell them anything we do before we do it. We told him the rules we follow when walls don't cooperate. Oxygen pressure held. For the first time in hours, the ICU felt like itself ordinary, undramatic, competent. The neurosurgeon called from OR. Your red save mattered. Thank the family in 2 for letting you borrow it. We'll bring you a coffee we didn't make. Post-action at 1600, the charge nurse said. She gave me room 3 for an hour's watch so she could build a list that might persuade money to upgrade machines instead of meetings. I sat with room 3's partner, the refinery man, and traded stories about pipes and pressure. When the trunk feeds the branches, he said, you keep the trunk honest by watching the smallest leaf. In 2, the transport vent behaved like it wanted a permanent job. The vintage machine, powered down respectfully, looked smaller than it had last night. I covered it with a drape the way you cover a sleeping dog. The daughter touched the orange vent with 2 fingers and said to her mother in Portuguese, we lent our light. They'll bring it back. The elevators auditioned for character roles again. Hold admits, Edie said. B-Bank is napping. We had learned how to stretch minutes. We looked at our plugs the way sailors look at the sky. The red outlets glowed the color of obedience. 8 breathed with the soft confidence of a person who is tired of drama. 9's home vent purred in its separate sovereignty. 5, extubated, asked if his victory could include juice. I stopped in 2 and said, thank you again, because gratitude is a currency I want to spend until it changes the exchange rate. You told me the reasons, the daughter said. Now I get to tell them too. We had made her a witness. Witnesses outlast outages. The pager on my hip did its old-fashioned bee sting, or again. Returning from Cronny in 40, holding in PACU 20. The red outlet would come home before dinner. I told the daughter, and she smiled. I wrote that down. I wrote everything down. The list had stopped being a list and started being a bridge to a day that wouldn't need our memory to make sense. Before the next admit, I walked the line of outlets with facilities and traced each circuit on the paper map. We marked which reds had proven faithful and which beige plugs had lied, then taped the legend to the unit clerk's desk. It wasn't art. It was a contract written in tape. The daughter from to read it, nodded once, and said, this helps me see the room the way you do. I told her that was the point. When the building becomes a story, we make sure everyone can read it. I see you, he said. We sent you thanks and a neurosurgery. Now we're sending a question. The blackout hit a dialysis center across town. We may get 3 patients who miss treatments and 1 who's crashing in the parking lot. No vents yet. No red outlets yet. But potassium doesn't care about our speeches. You have room for a dialysis machine that drinks more power than manners? I looked at our map. Bring them, I said, already feeling the arithmetic assemble. Bring them with the truth. We were not done choosing, but we were better at telling why. The call wasn't a storm. It was a tide. 3 from dialysis, Edie said. 2 missed sessions, 1 crashing in the parking lot. First 2 are awake and angry at fate. 3rd is altered, potassium unreadable because the machine blinked at us. EMS gave calcium on arrival. We're running insulin and dextrose. We need a machine and a red outlet. Maybe 2. Machines were money. Tonight they were math. We own 1 Kurt pump on the unit and could borrow 1 from cardiac if hearts allowed it. Intermittent hemodialysis was a different beast with a different thirst for power and water. Facilities could give us electricity. Water was the property of pipes and promises. Put the altered 1 in 4, the intensivist said. We'll run the hyperkalemia playbook while we spin up Kurt. Get EKG leads that don't believe lies. Pads on the chest. Calcium now, insulin and glucose now, albuterol neb, bicarbonate if needed. He pointed at me. You own the machine. Charge owns the map. Respiratory owns any air that objects. They arrived like weather fronts. First the two who had missed their appointments familiar to the ED staff the way regulars are familiar to bartenders, and then the crashing one whose body had declared independence from rhythm. We slid him into 4, the room we had designated as the tank bed earlier, because it sat closest to the subpanel that forgave us. The EKG on the screen drew T waves with opinions, tall and sarcastic. Calcium's in, pharmacy said, voice deliberately boring, the safest voice in medicine. Insulin's in. D50E's in. Neb is singing, respiratory added. Facilities rolled in with the borrowed Kurt unit like a chariot with too many tubes. Power draw nominal on red, the lead said, fingers on a clamp like a violinist's. Don't pair it with the bed heater or a kettle. Water, I asked. We can run off bags, he said. Central loop stable for now. But if the building coughs, you won't feel it. The crashing patient blinked at me with pupils that didn't agree on which room we were in. Name's Aaron, his sister said from the corner, knuckles white around a tote bag with a calendar spilling out. He misses appointments when his boss says the word overtime and forgets that overtime is just steal time with better shoes. We're going to put him on a machine that filters his blood the way kidneys should, I said. The first minutes are medicine. The next hours are plumbing. She nodded as if we had offered her a bucket and a map. We primed the Kurt circuit. Purple port, blue port, anticoagulation plan that respects the line and the person using it. His line flushed. The blood agreed to a new channel. The pump began its patient rotation. Cardiac can spare theirs, the clerk reported, one hand on a phone, the other sketching a fast diagram of who owed whom donuts. Runners on the way, we triaged the other two with temporizing mercy. Their potassium was high but not belligerent. We gave them insulin, glucose, and empathy. Nobody chooses a grid failure. One woman, Mirella, said, I told my son the city could teach algebra tonight. If A goes down and B is late and C is crooked, solve for me. We solved for her with posture and plan. Aaron's rhythm relented by degrees. The T waves stopped auditioning for Skyline. We kept the pads, because potassium is an accomplished actor. The effluent bag filled with the kind of brown that means body, not catastrophe. The pump clicked like a metronome learning a gentler song. Map check, the charge nurse said. We redrew our panel and added the new grid of the Kurt pumps. 2 red outlets for vents. 1 red for Kurt. 1 red promise back to or when the boy returned from his cranny. Beige plugs behaving as citizens. Facilities initialed the corners. We taped it over the old map and wrote V3. The daughter into watched us post it. Tell her, I said, and the charge nurse did, pointing to the lines and speaking in sentences. The daughter said, if your calls for their red, you can have ours back, and then added, you'll tell me before you touch anything, we promised in the voice you use for vows stored in public view. Cardiac's Kurt arrived with a small airplane hum. The tech who delivered it patted its side. She's touchy about alarms, he warned. Treat her like a cat. We placed the second missed session patient, the one whose potassium wanted headlines on the new circuit, and chose citrate over heparin. Meanwhile, Jocelyn stabilized enough to flirt with extubation criteria. Her partner asked if she could hear him. I told him hearing is stubborn. It survives nights. He whispered things that sounded like plans. Half an hour into Aaron's run, the building sighed. Not a surge, a dimming and recovery. The Kurt pumps didn't blink on red. A desktop at the station did, and the clerk sighed like a librarian whose catalog has learned nothing from history. In 8, the pigtail behaved as if it had graduated. In 2, the daughter taught her aunt how to read the new map. Matteo, granted a chair near his father's door, drew rectangles on a notepad. Red ones with crowns, beige ones with question marks. Then the borrowed machine from cardiac threw an air-in-line alarm like a petulant flute. We checked the line, eased the microbubble through the chamber, raised the bag, tapped the housing. It behaved. The patient's monitor didn't care about the drama. His numbers were having a quiet, adult conversation with chemistry. They were called to say the boy's brain had tolerated their argument and they were sending him to PACU. The red outlet would be ours again soon. The daughter and 2 exhaled like a person returning a borrowed dress without a stain. We were 3/4 of the way through a rhythm we had invented when security said, very calmly, facilities to ICU. Water main pressure trending low in the east riser while they rebalance the grid. House says it won't hit domestic taps. Dialysis loops may feel cranky. Heads up, run both machines off bags, the intensivist said. Switch Aaron first. He's more fragile if the loop burps. Facilities, watch the loop. Call us 30 seconds before any planned valve changes. Kurt off the water loop is comfort. Off bags, it is discipline. We hung fresh sterile bags and checked clamps like a pilot checks flaps. The pumps didn't care where water came from as long as it didn't stutter. They drank from gravity and principle. For a while, the unit forgot to be exciting. We brushed teeth. We remade beds around lines. Jocelyn squeezed my hand when we turned her a mouth later. Matteo fell asleep in his chair with the flashlight still in his pocket. The oxygen tree hummed. 2 alarms sang together, the Kurt's pressure alarm and a telemetry complaint about a loose lead. We solved both, lowered the pump speed a beat, replaced the lead, apologized to the sternum for stickers. Post-action still at 1600, the charge nurse said as she updated the board. We'll need to write water on the list, not just light. She added a blue dot for every room with a machine that would object to thirst. During a lull, I pulled out the bedside whiteboard and wrote a 3-line plan under the word today. 1. Protect rhythm. 2. Move potassium. 3. Protect machines. Families started pointing to the list when new people walked in. It turned the room into a common language. The refinery man asked if he could add a 4th line. He printed, in careful block letters, 4. Tell us why. We left it there on purpose. When Respiratory swapped a filter or facilities traced a cable, someone would tap the board and answer before being asked. The air changed when reasons arrived before questions. Near shift's end, I went room to room with a new ritual. A sentence to each family that started with because. Because we moved the outlet. Because we chose this machine first. Because your number dipped and came back. Because this is how we will know if tomorrow tries to be tonight again. Aaron's sister packed her tote and looked taller. If his boss says overtime again, she said, I'm going to tell him what the word costs. I signed the machine logs, initialed the map, and checked the bags one more time. The unit had become a ledger of choices. The city tried to remember its weekday name. The pager was quiet for a full minute. Then ED called with a different kind of tide. We've got smoke from the substation on 12th. City's rerouting traffic and maybe power. Facilities is looped in. If they have to island the hospital, your red stay red. Be advised, though elevators could nap, elevators again. Water maybe. We had learned the choreography. I looked at Aaron's rhythm, at Jocelyn's breaths, at the orange vent into, at Matteo asleep with a flashlight, at a map with red squares and blue dots and handwriting you could read from the door. Between heartbeats there is a space. Tonight we had filled it with calcium and circuits and sentences that started with because. And then the lights flickered once, only once, and a soft thump came from the east hall where the dialysis branch lives, the kind of thump a valve makes when it decides to argue with physics. I was already moving before the sound finished being a sound. The thump began as a rumor in the wall and became a syllable in the air. A second later, the Kurt pressure traces learned new accents. Delgado's access alarm flirted with red. Aaron's venous pressure climbed like someone had leaned on the line with their thumbs. East dialysis branch, facilities said into the radio, calm in the way you get when you've already run to the place that needs you. We're seeing oscillation at the manifold. It's not a break. It's a stubborn valve throwing a fit when the city's balance shifts. Hold at current settings, the intensivist said. Lower pump speeds by 10%, bags higher. If you feel the machine counseling you toward panic, ignore the appointment. He looked at me. You'll be at Delgado. If one filter has to wink, it will be his. We'll keep the medicine ready. The gauge climbed to more numbers and then hovered. I eased the speed a little further. The line softened. The alarm stayed quiet. Facilities to ICU, came the next update. We're at the east closet. The valve that coughed is old enough to remember when the hospital had a smoking lounge. We can baby it or we can bypass it. Bypass means a 15-second pressure wobble when we roll the temporary over. Say the word, bypass, the intensivist said. Count us down, Delgado's machine complained. I pressed the silence and held the clamp with my fingertips. Aaron's pump hardly noticed. The bags above him did the gravity work. Temporary in. Pressure nominal -5. Monitoring. Facilities sounded like someone who deserved applause and preferred coffee. In 2, the daughter had been counting. What now? She asked from the doorway. Now we watched the line look boring again, I said, and boredom felt like wealth. We used the steadier line to do something nights rarely grant. We taught while the room allowed it. I brought Aaron's sister to the map and traced with a capped marker how the east branch fed 4 and how the bypass now let the flow skirt the sulking valve. She asked the right question, what if another valve sulks? And the charge nurse answered, then we go to bags and to medicine again, and we tell you before the clamps move. Facilities texted a photograph valve, wrench, a small tag that read bypassed. They asked us to write the timestamp next to the word on our board so the night crew would inherit truth instead of rumor. Jocelyn's partner stood at her door and asked for the tiniest job that felt like a job. We gave him the pulse aux cable and asked him to keep it uncoiled and gentle when we turned her. Delgado's filter asked for a retirement party. The tech arrived with that expression that means I have 5 options and 3 work. We can baby it with pre-dilution, he said, swap it, or pause and run him on medical therapy while the other circuit buys us time. Delgado listened the way a person listens to weather. If pausing the machine makes room for someone else's minutes, he said, do that. I am a patient, not a collector. We documented the why on the board. Paused Delgado's curt for filter integrity. Continued medical therapy. Prioritizing Aaron's rhythm risk. The refinery man from 3 underlined why with the cap of his pen and said, this is how pipes should be labeled. The borrowed ventilator we had loaned to ED returned with a note on a glove. You saved our hallway. We put the glove on the board with a magnet and pretended it was art. Security visited the oxygen closet and hung a temporary placard. No adjustments. Call security. Call facilities. Call ICU. Under it, they left a dry erase line labeled because so any intervention would come with a sentence, not just a symbol. The neurologist called from PACU. The boy's numbers were steady. The plan was to keep his brain a quiet neighborhood. The red outlet would return after PACU signed off on his step down. We checked bags, checked clamps, checked ourselves. The map on the wall V3 looked crowded but legible. When we freed an outlet or traded a pump, we walked to the board, put a dot or a check, and spoke the reason. A traveler nurse floated in from another unit, watched twice, then joined us without being asked. Cardiac sent a message about reclaiming their curt later if the variable hearts demanded it. We negotiated kindly. 1 more hour for Aaron, then we would free the unit or send Delgado to the dialysis center if their lights stayed faithful. ED relayed that the center was sputtering back in patches. They can take 1 chair now, maybe 2 in an hour if roads behave, the attending said. We prepared transfers like a ship leaving harbor. Consents, numbers, a copy of the map. Aaron's sister wrote his name in block letters on the portable notes and added keep rhythm, keep reasons. The ethics consultant, finishing her lap of the rooms, pointed at our board. Your why sentences are on the wall before the action, she said. That's dosage. Keep dosing. Halfway through the hour, facilities asked for attention. We're going to open the bypass fully and lock the old valve out, the lead said. Expect a momentary change in tone at the pump heads. Count with us. The board gained a new word, lockout, and a small red slash across the old valve square. Security reported that B-Bank elevators were pausing again, so transport adjusted routes. We staged stretchers by the North Service. A lull arrived. We used it for teaching. Respiratory showed a resident the rule of 3 for circuit changes: someone to count, someone to watch chest rise, someone to watch the number. Pharmacy review D50 dosing. Facilities let Mateo wear a spare lockout tag and showed him where oxygen stocks like to hide behind cabinets. Then lab paged with a small gift. Jocelyn ABG improved. CO down. pH better. We moved extubation to the safe side of the rehearsal planned for 18 o'clock. The dialysis center called again. 2 chairs open in 20, the nurse said. Lights are boring. We accepted the offering. Mirella would go first. Aaron would finish his run with us and then we would decide. Delgado would finish here. I walked the line of outlets and traced each cable. Red to 2, red to 8, red to Kurt. Beige where beige could be trusted, ups where beige pretended. The oxygen queen sang. Transport arrived for Mirella. We navigated the corners and signed the handoff. The map had more checks than questions. The board's boxes light, water, breath, words held. Facilities asked for a quick huddle. The power company wanted to island the hospital for 5 minutes at 18 o'clock as a rehearsal. We'll do it, the charge nurse said, if we narrate it. No silent switches. The engineer on the phone promised a countdown we could hear. We rehearsed how to rehearse. Pre-oxygenate the rooms we owe breaths to. Lower non-essential pump speeds, a whisper. Check clamps, check bags, check the map. Move Jocelyn's trial to after. Make sure the red outlets know we are watching them. Write a sentence about why on the board before any finger touches a plug. With 15 minutes to go, I walked the unit. 8's wife still slept. 2's daughter adjusted her scarf and stood watch. Mateo drew a tiny metronome in the corner of the map and labeled it count. We used the renewed quiet to rehearse the 5-minute plan in miniature. At each doorway, we spoke the same short script so it would live in our mouths when the clock struck. Because we are rehearsing, we will lower non-essentials, pre-oxygenate, and keep you informed every 30 seconds. Families repeated the line back. The repetition made courage easier to find. A small incident tried to audition for attention. A battery cart snagged a floor seam and tugged at a power cord near 7. 2 people reached at once. The charge nurse's hand got there first and turned the reach into a narration instead of a yank. Because this cord matters, I'm moving it to the left, she said. We moved it, retaped it, and wrote cord migrated on the board with a time. I stood with Aaron's sister and practiced the 30-second updates we planned to speak during the islanding. She asked if she could own one of the announcements for his bedside. We said yes, and she wrote it on her palm. Because your rhythm is steady, we are keeping the same settings. The intensivist built a tiny timeline on the whiteboard for the rehearsal window, 5 columns, 1 for each minute. Under minute 1, he wrote count plus confirm. Under minute 2, speak plus breathe. Under minute 3, check plus chart. Under minute 4, repeat plus reassure. Under minute 5, return plus review. The ethicist nodded. This is a prophylaxis schedule, she said. Facilities radioed a last detail. The engineer in the basement would call out the countdown on speaker so the numbers would belong to all of us. We tested the speakerphone and made sure the voice carried but did not shout. The clerk wrote the direct line on a sticky and put it on the map's edge. Mateo underlined the number twice. Delgado woke and wanted the summary. I gave him the 1-minute version. Valve bypassed, filter swapped, medicine holding the line, transfer deferred until the road remembered its manners. Do you want the longer version? I asked. He shook his head. I want the one my wife can repeat, he said. We practiced a sentence for her. Because the water took the long way, they gave the machine a rest and used medicine as a bridge. Jocelyn's partner brought me a question he had written down. If the lights blink, does that make the tube blink? I told him the ventilator had its own battery, and that we would be at the bedside counting with her. The counting helps me too, he said. At the nurse's station, the traveler nurse asked for a job. We gave her the role of minute caller for the east hallway to speak the time at the top of each 30-second mark so the unit would stay in rhythm. She practiced once and found a cadence that felt like a metronome you could trust. The last thing we did before the rehearsal was a circle no bigger than a doorframe. Not a prayer, just a list. We named the rooms that depended on us most and the moves we would refuse to make unless the world forced our hand. We ended with the sentence we had been training all day to say, because we say it first, panic doesn't get to. Then the phone at the clerk's desk rang with a sound that belonged to the world outside the river we had become. The power company asking for the person who could agree to the plan test in writing. The charge nurse looked at me at facilities at the board with its boxes. We'll sign, she said, if the first line says because. We stood at the map and sharpened our pencils. The rehearsal was scheduled for 18:05 minutes of islanding the hospital from the city's grid while the power company traced its own valves and promises. We had 2 hours to turn the last 12 into a story that a stranger could read and still understand why we did what we did. We began the post-action in the glass room with a ring from someone else's coffee and a view of a hallway that had learned patience. The intensivist wrote the boxes across the top of the whiteboard: light, water, breath, words, after, and then passed the marker to anyone with something to confess or to celebrate. We are not here for guilt, he said. We are here for receipts. Facility started with maps. The lead drew the electrical tree with a pen that squeaked and labeled the true reds with their panel names like families. He added a note about the east dialysis valve stubborn, pre-1978, responds to flattery and bypass, and recommended a service ticket with a budget number attached so it would travel. He taped a laminated quick reference under the big map. If you lose your breath, call us, not the wall. Respiratory followed with promises we can safely make. It was short by design. We can bag anyone here in less than 10 seconds. We can move between wall and tank or vent and bag without losing saturations if A. Someone is counting, B. Someone is watching chest rise, C. Someone is naming the step aloud. Next to it she wrote lies we will not tell, the wall will hold, the surge is over, this vent never throws code 31. The honesty made the room sturdier. Pharmacy made a column headed bias for action. Calcium stocked at bedside for hyper-K rooms. Insulin and D50 pre-draw templates when grid reports instability. Nebs loaded. Paper order sets live where batteries do not. She drew a small heart next to paper and we forgave the heart because it was right. The ethics consultant read from her notebook of because sentences that had been said aloud during the day. She didn't grade us. She underlined the ones that had been spoken before we acted instead of after. Transparency is prophylaxis, she said again. Dose it early, then families joined us, because we invited them on purpose. Room 2's daughter came with her scarf and her notes and sat next to facilities like a colleague. Aaron's sister arrived with the tote bag that had become a character in our story. The refinery man stood behind a chair because that is how refinery men attend meetings. Mateo came because he had drawn the map when we were too busy being inside it to draw one. He stood by the corner of the board and held the marker as if it were a small flashlight. Room 2's daughter said, "You taught me that a red outlet is a promise to many, not just to me. I did not like that at first, but you told me the reasons before you took it away. That made it survivable." She looked at the board and, without asking, wrote consent is not just a signature under words. Aaron's sister said, "You taught me the names of the things you were doing while I was pretending to breathe for him. Calcium is armor. Insulin is a bridge. Bags are water when pipes are stubborn. I will teach him those names so he can stop pretending he is the only person who has to be brave." She slid her list into the ethics consultant's notebook like a recipe card you hand down. The refinery man said, "You labeled your pipes." I could see where the pressure should go. When numbers went down, it looked like weather, not a secret. He pointed at light and wrote, "Never hide the map." Matteo raised his hand because the world is kinder when you raise your hand. You taught me that when something is red, it means it won't give up even if the building is tired. But it can move. That part was new. He drew a box around light and added a small blue dot next to it. Water, he said, and the room smiled at his audit. We listed what broke. The telemetry server had amnesia at inopportune times. 2 battery cards had wheels that stuck like old grudges. The east dialysis valve had a history we could no longer pretend was charming. The transport vent in 7 had a personality, and we did not want personalities in transport vents. We added elevators practice naps to the list with a note to change routes before they taught us the lesson again. We listed what worked. Hand counts, paper maps, saying because before fingers touched plugs, facilities treating oxygen like a queen and not like a rumor, families who believed us even when the math was rude, the red outlets that behaved like the laws they were meant to be, the orange transport vent in 2 acting like a citizen instead of a diva. We assigned owners. Facilities took the valve and the carts. Biomed took the transport vent and the telemetry server's hobby of napping. Nursing took the map, the hand counts, and the habit of writing because on clipboards. Ethics took the dose of transparency and promised to make a laminated card that said "Tell them first" in a font that did not apologize for itself. Security took the oxygen closet wheel and ordered a lock that speaks in both English and human. We sketched a 1-page checklist to live behind every red outlet panel. A left column with what we touch, a right column with who we tell. Under it, we wrote 3 sample scripts in plain language, 1 for families, 1 for ED, 1 for facilities because words are equipment when the room is loud. We printed the sheet and slid it into plastic. Paper can be brave if you laminate it. Biomed proposed color dots for transport vents that behaved perfectly during the blackout, and stars for those that sulked. No punishment, just memory you can see. Housekeeping asked for their own line item. A way to move linen cards so power cords stop pretending to be vines. Security promised to train volunteers to point families toward the places where maps live. When the families stepped out for coffee, we kept writing. We drew the oxygen manifold like a crown and labeled each jewel. We added a small box titled "If someone touches the wheel," and under it a single instruction: hands off. Call security. Call facilities. Call us. The memory of the man at the valve had turned from a scare into a policy. The refinery man nodded at the wheel box and said, "That's the sticker you put on a door before anyone makes a mistake they can't untwist." We also made a promise to ourselves, one we could keep without budget or signatures. Every major decision gets a time-stamped note, a plain sentence, and a name. No poetry, no drama. Reasons are easier to share when they are not trying to be admired. The power company called to confirm the rehearsal. "At 1800 we'll island you for 5, the engineer said. "You shouldn't feel it." We explained we have learned not to trust sentences with shouldn't in them. He accepted this and said, "We'll be in your basement watching the meters. If you feel anything, call the number on the laminated card, not the one on the website." He had learned our religion already. We told the unit what was coming. We told the families. We told the machines, because it felt polite. We pre-oxygenated the rooms we owed breaths to. We moved Jocelyn's extubation plan to after the test, because numbers are proud. They hate being asked to multitask mid-ceremony. We gave the red outlets a pep talk we pretended was a checklist. We lowered the pump speeds to a place that felt like caution without fear. We stood by the map with our pencils sharpened and our sentences ready to begin with "B at 18 o'clock. The islanding began." Nothing dramatic happened, which is to say the rehearsal deserved a standing ovation. The overheads blinked in the polite way lights blink when they are in the hands of professionals. The curd pumps continued like metronomes that had married principle. The vents behaved. The telemetry server thought about drama and remembered its place. The oxygen queen hummed in the same key as the generator and looked pleased. Every 30 seconds, the minute caller in the East Hall read the time and one sentence. "Back in the silence of 5 minutes you can learn who you are." We learned that preparation makes boredom sacred. We learned that because fits on a whiteboard line and can still hold a whole corridor. We learned that red is a color you can trust if you name it out loud before you need it. We learned that counting calms hands. We clapped quietly because applause has to match the size of the thing. We returned the borrowed BiPAP to ED with a note that said, "Good philosopher, please keep." We handed Mateo a spare marker as payment for services rendered. We gave the refinery man a facilities badge sticker that said honorary in small letters and friend in large ones. We put the glove from Edie's thank you on the board with a magnet and pretended it was art. Then we finished the patients in front of us. Aaron's run ended with a number you could forgive. Delgado's second run ended with a number you could introduce to an intern without scaring them. Mirella called from the dialysis center to say the lights were the good kind of boring and to ask if we had eaten. Jocelyn did her trial, breathed the way people breathe when they are almost themselves again, and chose to wait 1 more hour because wisdom is a form of strength. 8 stayed steady. 9 remained sovereign. The hallway returned to its weekday posture. Transport negotiated with elevators that still liked the idea of naps. Housekeeping rolled a mop past the oxygen closet and saluted the new sign. The clerk put a copy of the laminated scripts at the front desk for the night shift with a sticky on top that said use these out loud. We closed loops. We called families before they had to call us. We told each room what the rehearsal had meant for them in one sentence that began with because. Because the islanding went well, we did not need to change your settings. Because your number dipped and came back, we wrote it down before it could become a rumor. Because the red outlet is yours again, we will tell you if we borrow it. People nodded like citizens at a town hall where the microphones finally worked. The post-action moved to its last box. After, we wrote 3 things no one wanted to forget when morning arrived with clean clothes and selective memory. 1. The map lives where people can see it. 2. Reasons get laminated. 3. Families stand at the board with us. The ethics consultant added a 4th. 4. Practice is part of care. We drew a little crown above oxygen and a little lock next to dialysis valve and a small metronome next to count. What could have stayed a mood had been turned into a method. At the very end, long after the rehearsal and the lists and the gentle applause, I walked past the map and saw a child's handwriting added to the corner. Mateo's, unmistakable. He had drawn a tiny red square and written, "This is a promise. Share it." It was not policy. It was better. We left it there. When I finally signed my last note and looked at my hands, they were the hands of someone who had been holding a wheel all day, the oxygen wheel, the wheel of a decision, the wheel on a map that points toward because. Aaron's sister hugged me with one arm and said, "Next time I'm going to bring snacks before anyone is brave enough to admit they need them." Room 2's daughter squeezed my shoulder and said, "You can borrow our red again if you tell me first." The refinery man said, "Call me if a valve wants an uncle." Mateo, who had kept the unit honest with drawings, held up his notepad where he had written, "We kept the lights on," and then, under it, "We kept the reasons on." Outside, the city sirens sounded like punctuation instead of plot. Inside, the oxygen queen purred the way grandmothers purr when a house is fed and the children are finally asleep. The board read after in a hand that looked like a person who knows the next morning will ask for copies. The laminated card on the manifold caught the light and looked briefly like a small flag. Between heartbeats there is a space. Last night we filled it with decisions spoken aloud. Today we filled it with reasons. Tomorrow, if the grid forgets our name again, we will start with the same word we used when it mattered most. Because